thing. Please. A second. Oh, brilliant. Oh yeah, thank you everyone so much for coming to us on this Tuesday afternoon. Really nice to see everyone here. And as I was saying before, but some of you might have missed it, we're sadly down Gernot Klanchnig, who unfortunately has the old dreaded 2 lines on the COVID test came up positive. So, and Gernot's not feeling at all well. So unfortunately we are missing Gernot for this event. But we really hope that this event will lead to a lot of others in the future, that we can get going around this project, around cannabis in Africa, but also around wider themes of drugs and in Africa more broadly as well. So we'll speak a little bit to that later on as we get through the talk. Yeah, so my name's Neil Carrier. I'll give a bit more of a bio of myself. We've got a slide with all our bios on, so we'll all speak to that a little bit later. So, but yeah, my name's Neil Carrier, and I'll start off proceedings. But I'm very happy to say that we have Kelly Fortune, who's an alumna of the University of Cape Town, who's very kindly come to step in as chairperson of proceedings. So. And Kelly's been doing quite a bit of research on cannabis as well. So really great that she's been able to come along and take in the role of officiant at proceedings. But yeah, just to give an overview of what we're going to try and cover today. So obviously this is all about this project, Cannabis Africana, drugs in development in Africa. So what we want to do today is really give it the belated launch that this project needs, really. As you know, many of us has found COVID over the past 2 years has really really restricted us for getting projects like this up and running. So we have been technically running the project for a while, and we've been busy behind the scenes, getting some things in place, doing some archival research and setting out the groundwork. But yes, it's still the time really to launch the project. So what we want to do is introduce you to the core team involved in the project. Also look at the geographical focal areas and topics, and obviously Cannabis Africana is kind of a very broad title indeed. So and in the project we are narrowing it down to specific focal areas, which we'll discuss a little bit in the moments to come. Also want to tell you a bit about project events that will be linked to the project, and would just be wonderful to get everyone involved with. As as much involvement as you can spare would be fantastic, and we'll give you a little overview of what we'll be planning there. Also a little bit about the advisory board of the project in particular, and the network that we're trying to establish around the theme of drugs in Africa. Which I'll say a little bit more of a little bit later as well. And then basically, yeah, we'll have time at the end for interactive discussions and questions and commentary, which very kindly Kelly has agreed to chair for us. So moving to the next slide. Yeah, so the project overview, the time frame of the project has technically been October 2022, 2023, 24, but COVID has really prevented us from really getting to grips with a lot of what we wanted to do. In terms of getting out to the particular countries and particular field sites that we hope to engage with as part of this project. So yes, we might hopefully be able to get an extension beyond 2023-24 for some of the activities we'll be doing, in case that COVID delay prevents us from really wrapping things up as we want to. But the whole project, which is funded by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council, the whole focus of this project is about this theme of drugs and development, which has become quite a theme, not just regarding African countries, but in other regions of the world as well, in Central Asia and other parts of the world, places like Colombia. You know, this has become quite a big issue in a lot of key literature and key projects that are ongoing at the moment. And not just from a point of view of academics, but also from people working for NGOs and government policymakers and so forth. Yeah, this link between drugs and development has really caught the imagination and been seen as quite a critical thing to look at. You know, what's really the relationship between drugs and the drugs trade and development, in whether negative or positive or more ambiguous than that, as probably is likely to be the case in some instances anyway. So this was really where we pitched the project around that theme of drugs and development. But basically the substantive part of the project will be partly historical. So a key aspect of what we'll be doing is really to flesh out a lot of the history of cannabis in sub-Saharan Africa, which has become our key focus. Though obviously the relationship with North Africa is quite a key issue that we should engage with as part of this as well. But our main focal areas, our main case studies are in sub-Saharan Africa, as we'll come on to shortly. So really, there has been historical work before and archival research, but we really want to flesh out these cannabis histories, you know, these particular cannabis histories, which can be very different in the different focal areas that we'll be looking at. And then really related to that, we'll be working on we'll be working on the much more contemporary focus as well, like trying to understand the contemporary place, purpose and utility, or at least perceived utility, of cannabis, you know, how it does fit into livelihoods, patterns of consumption, debates about policy and these kind of things. So we've got this kind of or two strands really, that historical strand and this very contemporary strand as well. So to do this, to really narrow things down, we'll be looking at the cultures of consumption and cultures of cultivation and trade as well, and histories of consumption, trade and production in 4 select sub-Saharan countries, and really trying to assess the impact of drug policy on cannabis production, distribution and use. And obviously, you know, this project is coming in at a time where cannabis policy in particular is being very much debated worldwide. You know, there's more and more interest, and policy is changing in a lot of places. Obviously, you know, various states in the United States, Canada, South Africa, as you know, one of our case studies indeed, is policy has changed quite significantly there, as my colleague Simon will talk to in a moment. So there's a lot of change in a lot of flux in relation to cannabis policy. So this is obviously a key, not background really, but a key element that we're incorporating into our research. How all these policy debates, whether global or, you know, the more local ones, how they are affecting things and maybe generating new policy or new ways of looking at cannabis as a, you know, and perhaps its potential or its harms and so forth. So I think to emphasize really is that the project, even though technically we've been going for quite a while with the COVID delays, the project is still at quite a formative pre-field work stage. So what we really want today is really to hear from you guys as well, to get your inputs, your advice, you know, particular themes that you might think we really should focus on, or wants to emphasize, maybe wants to de-emphasize a little bit. But yeah, really want to hear from you guys, and you know, help be guided by you guys of how we push the project forward. Go to the next slide. So yes, just to say a little bit about ourselves. I believe we do very kindly have some members of our esteemed advisory board who have made it along, but we're very lucky as part of the project to have really good people behind us to, you know, as we do push on with the project, who will be incorporating in events and all sorts of things, obviously to as they are happy with. We're not going to force things on them in particular, but we've very happy to have key people on the project advisory board, including Professor Isidore Obot, who I'm not sure he's been able to join us just yet, but who's a professor at the University of Uyo in Nigeria, and also the director of CRISA, the Centre for Research and Information of Substance Abuse, a West African organisation that we are working with and we'll be having events with as we'll move on. So Professor Isidore Obot, we've got on the advisory board. Also Professor Tembisa Wichen of the University of Johannesburg, Professor Dave Anderson, Professor of History at the University of Warwick, and then also Professor Justin Willis, who I know is with us today, and also Professor Sloan Mahone of the University of Oxford, who are on our advisory board as well. So very warm welcome to them, and feel free to chip in as well at any times. But with the project advisory board, the core team, the people working on the project, our colleague Gernot Klanchnig, who, like I say, sadly has not been able to make it today due to illness. But Gernot's Associate Professor in International Criminology here at the University of Bristol. And his work, I'm sure many of you will know his work anyway, but really a focus on the policy and history of drugs, especially in Nigeria. And he's also principal investigator of another current project, Hidden Narratives of Illicit Livelihoods in West Africa, as well as the principal investigator of this current project, Cannabis Africana. And then there's myself. So I'm an associate professor of social anthropology at the University of Bristol. And I've worked on various themes in my career, but a lot has been around the anthropology of drugs. And I really started all out in Kenya, studying the substance cat, or miraa, as it's more commonly known in Kenya, for my PhD. And since then, I've worked on various other themes around drugs in Africa, including broader work with Gernot on other substances, culminating as well with this project on cannabis as well. But I've also done some work on archival film and photography in East Africa and urban transformation in Nairobi. So a few different projects I've been involved with. Then, we have Clemens Rusenga, who I'll let introduce himself. Over to you, Clemens.
Thank you so much, Neil, and a good welcome to all. My name is Clemens Rusenga. I'm a research associate at the School for Policy Studies, University of Bristol. I'm also a researcher on this project, Cannabis Africana, and I will be leading the research focusing on Zimbabwe more specifically. My work focuses on land and agrarian studies in Southern Africa, and recently also the nexus between cannabis, land development, and their implications for cannabis policy, especially given the current cannabis policy reforms that are taking place in Zimbabwe, Southern Africa, and in other parts of Africa in general. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Clemens. And then, if Simon Howell, would you like to introduce yourself now?
Thanks, Neil. So I am Simon Howell. I'm a research associate at the Centre of Criminology and the Global Risk Governance Program at UCT. I have, for quite a few years, focused on various concerns around illegal drug use, gangs, and the policing thereof in South Africa, and primarily, in terms of socioeconomic concerns and structural factors that influence and create the issues that we see in the country. And I will be focusing specifically on South Africa, I think, in terms of this project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you, Clemens. So that's our core team. And this does relate really to our focal areas. So where we're really hoping to kind of, do a deep dive into various histories and contemporary processes and dynamics related to cannabis trade, policy, consumption in the particular areas we're focusing in on. So these will include West Africa, Nigeria in particular, which Gernot will be taking the lead on. There'll be a focus on East Africa, mainly Kenya, but also with a wider regional aspect there as well, which I'll be taking the lead on. Clemens, as he mentioned, will be taking the lead on the Zimbabwe aspect of the research, and Simon will be focusing on South Africa. And a lot of the developments there, which have been so fascinating in recent years. So just in Gernot's absence, you're hearing rather a lot from me today, but just in Gernot's absence, if I just take you through some of the points that he'll really be trying to take a key look at. So Gernot's focus, a lot of this will be on southwestern Nigeria and Lagos, kind of linking to a lot of research that Gernot's done previously, mainly focusing more on the hard drugs trade in Nigeria that Gernot focused on in his earlier research projects. And he's really looking at Nigeria's a really interesting case study. And this is, perhaps something why we chose these particular case studies, because I think they all are at all the debates are slightly different in these various focal areas where we're geographical areas where we're looking at. And we've obviously linked to the particular histories and particular political dynamics of the individual countries and regions. So Gernot's really looking at Nigeria as a place where a lot of policy regarding drugs has been very much repressive in its nature. So with a lot of kind of history of very hard policy of prohibition and so forth, and linked to hard drugs, but also cannabis has fitted into this quite strongly. With often very people being locked up for quite a long time for very small amounts of cannabis. So Gernot's really looking at a country and a region with this kind of very repressive context, and perhaps and really a region that has a slightly different history in some ways of a relationship with cannabis. So West Africa, its historical relationship with cannabis, places like Nigeria seem quite a lot more recent, and some people put this down to sort of post-Second World War kind of era, when cannabis as a commodity, an item of consumption, more took off in places like, in countries like Nigeria and in West Africa, which compares to an earlier history in East Africa and Southern Africa and Central Africa as well. But again, that's going to be looking at the rural history of cannabis and, contrasting this with what would be seen as more respectable kind of legitimate crops. The history of things like crops like cocoa in West Africa. So he'll be very much looking at the rural history of these and the contemporary dynamics and livelihoods and so forth in West Africa as well. But also, as quite a lot of us will, he'll be having quite a focus on the urban aspects of cannabis as well. So how it does fit into urban life worlds, urban cultures of consumption, how it links to various aspects of work in contemporary West Africa, how trade is conducted in more urban areas as well. And the key focus that we're developing, and would be nice to get some feedback from people, but a key focus we're working on as well is about music. So obviously West Africa, Nigeria in particular, there's all the wonderful history of Fela Kuti and the symbolism of cannabis for Fela Kuti and his kind of symbol of defiance and resistance. So and the kind of wider aspects of where cannabis links to music and cultures around music that again that's going to be looking at. So yeah, very, very much looking at this rural history, links to livelihoods in the rural region, but also this more urban aspect as well. So I shall pass on to Simon, who will tell us a bit about South Africa.
Thanks, Neil. So, I mean, my focus is on South Africa, and specifically, around the policing and legislative context of cannabis in the country. As I'm sure many of you are aware, we have, in the last decade or so, had undertaken quite a significant change in the way in which cannabis is understood, in terms of the law and in terms of the way in which it's policed. The result of which has been, in my experience, a lot of confusion. So we are essentially trying to understand how this confusion has occurred and how the debates have shaped the law and vice versa. There's been a long history of suppression and oppression and a very punitive approach to the policing of drugs in general and cannabis as a part of that. And as a result, with the legislative changes, there's been, at least within the policing domain, a lot of concern around how to control cannabis and whether indeed it should be controlled in the first place. So, I mean, South Africa presents a unique opportunity to engage with a changing environment in terms of policy and legislation as it occurs, in the moment. I think, South Africa is at the point now where it is aiming to commercialize and begin the process of producing cannabis at a large scale for export and the like. but is equally still in a sort of existential crisis as to how to understand the substance and understand its use amongst people. Because we do have at the moment an allowance for private use, but that private use is so badly defined that it creates a mass misunderstanding. Now, what I would like to do also is investigate the history of policing and the history of cannabis simultaneously, because I think one can tell a story about both using what ironically is polar opposites. So, in the sense, one can tell the history of policing via the lens of cannabis, even though cannabis has been, they essentially rejected from the policing, or has become a target of policing. And finally, I think it's important to investigate the wider impact that these cultural and legislative changes have had on the criminal justice system and society as a whole. Drugs are one of the primary policing domains for both in terms of time and occupancy, but also in terms of incarcerations and the like in South Africa. So it's, even despite our very violent society, drugs are still considered a far worse evil. And we need to understand why and how, but also what the impact of something like the pseudo or semi-legalization of cannabis has had on that domain and on both the criminal justice system in terms of policing, but also in terms of incarcerations and the justice system and the courts, which thus far have been investigated to some extent by others, but still require further and deeper analysis. So that's essentially where I think we will go with South Africa. Thank you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Simon. Just realized you were all hidden. I think it is coming directly from my screen, isn't it? So I don't know if I press one of these, would I get you down the side? Always a little bit reluctant to try in case. I'll leave it there for now. There we go. Oh, but over to you, Clemenson. Seems to have worked out. Over to you, Clemenson, Zimbabwe.
All right. Thank you so much, Neil. And again, like my colleagues have highlighted, cannabis has a long history. That's the same thing also. There's a long history of engagement, be it cultivation, trade and consumption in Zimbabwe. And for all these generations, it has been small producers who have been custodians of the cannabis plant and its knowledge. And the Zimbabwean state, in its modern formation, it has been consistent with the international drug policies that have outlawed cannabis production, I think from the 1920s, but we begin to see more of a crackdown from the 1950s onwards. But since 2018, the Zimbabwe has been one of the early countries in Africa that have legalized cannabis for medical and scientific purposes. And I think, like what Simon has highlighted, there is this narrow definition or framing of what is being legalized. So in this case, it's the cannabis being framed. What is legalized is for medical and scientific purposes. But what are the implications of these new policy changes? You find that the activities of many small producers are not captured within the legal framing of what is allowed as production. So you find that the definition of even the medical, what is medical and scientific also doesn't capture the many uses and the many meanings that cannabis has for many people and their relationship with the cannabis, be it from a socio-economic perspective, be it also from a medical perspective, but outside the scientific definition of what is medical cannabis. So then what are the implications? So I'm interested also at trying to look at the implications of this, the manner in which the legalization or legal framing of what is legalized in Zimbabwe. What are the implications of such, especially for inclusivity and the livelihoods of those who are involved. And so what is fascinating for me is the manifestation of a dual model, kind of, where on one hand you have those who have resources, including agribusinesses, international corporations, who are able to meet the strict requirements that one has to fulfill or satisfy in order to be given a permit to produce medically. You will find that they are able to benefit to be able to do so. I think it is just on the 11th of May, the president was commissioning a 27 million, what was built to be a $27 million US project by a Swiss bioceuticals company. But at the same time, while those who have resources are able to navigate and be able to benefit within the legal framework, but the majority are still trapped in what you can see in that image on the background there, where this man has been visited by the police. They are destroying what maybe he had been tendering for some time, investing his time, thinking that he will make a livelihood out of that. So it's this continued criminalization of production for those who are not able to satisfy the requirements of legal cannabis production, that is the medical and scientific purpose. So I think these are some of the questions that are fascinating for me, and also the implications of such for the agrarian livelihoods of those who for generations have been depending on this. So the questions of inclusivity, they are key issues that I'm interested on here. Thank you so much, Neil.
Oh, thank you so much, Clemens. Yeah, and those aspects, I think, especially around this, as you were mentioning, Clemens, like corporate capture, that kind of theme is coming out quite strongly in a lot of the research, you know, not just in the case studies we're looking at, but across the continent as policy is changing. This issue of or the dangers of corporate capture is something that's really seems to be an emergent theme in a lot of this. Yeah, and then just to say a little bit about East Africa, which is where I'll be looking at in particular. So hopefully working with Kenyan colleagues, mostly starting off, I think, with a
Is it just me, or is Neil freezing?
I think Neil is freezing.
Still seen as quite a hotspot of where cannabis is being produced and consumed in Kenya and in the wider region. So Western Kenya is going to be quite a key focus of where I'll be looking at for my my research project. Also looking at more urban aspects, Nairobi, pulling out there, where, you know, with lots of really interesting stories and histories and present dynamics to pull out in the city in Nairobi. But also wider regional trade is something I'm really interested in, as I'll come on to in a moment. So yeah, with East Africa in particular, there is quite a long history of cannabis farming, trade and use in Kenya. And also kind of East Africa's links to the wider regions, you know, the Western Indian Ocean region and India in particular, you know, lots of old networks of bringing various forms of cannabis and other similar substances into ports like Mombasa and Lamu and so forth. So it's this kind of wider history, and there's a lot in the archives to do with cannabis that hopefully I can flesh out more and do some oral histories as well in Kenya, in Western Kenya, but elsewhere as well, on try and get some oral histories of 20th century cannabis in Kenya and beyond. And Kenya is quite interesting, as it's a place where there is increasing debate and calls for policy reform. So it's yeah, things haven't moved as far as South Africa in actually changing policy, but I think it is quite significant in a country like Kenya that within Parliament and other legislative forums, you are getting more and more debates about cannabis nowadays. Over the last decade or so. So debate really is hotting up. A lot of it may be coming more from that Western Kenya region, which does have this long history of cultivation and consumption. But beyond that as well, there's quite a lot of interest. Some of it more economic, you know, how Kenya might be able to leverage a lot of the growing demand for cannabis around the world, you know, as it becomes legal in places like Canada. You know, what quite a few Kenyans, I think, feel that Kenya might be left out if they don't leverage what they might see of advantages in Kenya to be able to grow this substance. So yeah, really increasing debates. Also quite a colonial aspect to it as well. Like you know, a lot of the debate does center around cannabis or cannabis laws, the laws prohibiting cannabis in Eastern Africa as having been a colonial imposition. So that's interesting historically, but also, you know, as that does feed into current debates on policy in Kenya today. And one aspect I'm really fascinated by is a regional trade, because Kenya is a country that, you know, can very much produce its own cannabis. It's such a fertile country, and places like Mount Kenya, Western Kenya, you know, there's a huge long histories of producing cannabis. But it seems there's a lot of demand in Kenya and in places like Nairobi for cannabis that's coming from elsewhere. So you do hear of traders who are bringing cannabis from places as far afield as Malawi, you know, and then smuggling it through from Malawi through Tanzania into Kenya to then sell in Nairobi. But also really interesting to me, because quite a lot of my research in the past has been in northern Kenya, you know, the bordering area with Ethiopia. But there's quite and I'm not sure how recent this history is. So this is one thing I'm quite interested in really following up. But now in a very much in-demand variety of cannabis in Nairobi and elsewhere is called shash, the name of which comes from Shashamane, the Ethiopian town. And the Ethiopian town were obviously, you know, some Rastafarians settled, and it has that kind of history. But this variety has really become in demand in Nairobi, and is spoken about quite a bit, shash. And you do hear more and more people who get arrested for for smuggling cannabis over that Ethiopia-Kenya border. And interestingly, often going into more Somali regions, parts of Kenya, like through Wajir, places like this. For people who know the geography, there's been quite a few consignments that have been seized in that kind of area, transporting shash from Ethiopia down into Nairobi. So I'm really interested in that aspect as well, you know, how this all links together in a regional trade, and also those cultures of consumption and how different types of cannabis might be seen in particular ways, and all that maybe connoisseurship sort of thing that might that goes on around cannabis, and how that might play out in the East African context as well. Also quite a lot of trade from Tanzania as well on that regional trade, cross-border Tanzania-Kenya trade, which is quite interesting as well. And also, yeah, this is very much something that's it really does seem to fit into a youth culture. And again, linking back to that theme that I mentioned in Gernot's research, linked to music, you know, and all those aspects in Nigeria, Fela Kuti. But it's quite interesting in Kenya at the moment, you're getting a lot more musical artists who are a lot more open about their cannabis consumption. Yeah, for some people who might know, the picture on the screen is an image, drawing of Virusi Mbaya, a Kenyan artist, and he's sung quite openly and done videos, you know, quite openly smoking cannabis. And there's other musicians as well who, you know, nowadays seem very happy to be quite open in their consumption. So how this all links again through music and into youth cultures, and what that might say as well about changing attitudes towards it. You know, I think maybe 10 years ago, I don't remember anyone, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember music videos being so open about cannabis consumption. You know, it might have been mentioned, but maybe in a more hidden kind of way, whereas it does seem very very blatant now, you know, people smoking, and you know, what are the dynamics going on there? I really do find fascinating. So yeah, these are kind of things. So I think, as you can see, like, our regions will have different kind of dynamics, and especially in terms of legality as well. So we'll be looking at the legal context in all these, and yeah, and how it changed, you know, more repressive history. Kenya, perhaps somewhere where these debates seem to be gaining traction, and then South Africa, that obviously in terms of where it's gone in terms of shifting policy and so forth, is you know, really interesting case study as well, and Zimbabwe as well, which has again changed its policy in terms of the agriculture of production of cannabis. So yeah, so that's basically our case studies that we're all, you know, really itching to get to grips with. And I think some of us are now planning our first bits of research, you know, direct kind of research. We have done quite a bit of archival research, going to Oxford, for example, looking at a lot of the old colonial records there, and other archives are, you know, in Southern Africa as well. And we do have some archival resources already from East Africa, but really want to, you know, build on what we've got already in that regard, but also really get quite hands-on in terms of the actual work we want to do. So yeah, I'm planning my first trip to Kenya early July. I think Clemens, you'll be planning to get to Zimbabwe quite soon, is that right as well?
Yes, in July as well.
Yeah. So we really hope, and Simon as well, I think you're gonna, things will accelerate, won't they, quite soon as well, in terms of, and I know Gernot as well is planning a trip to Nigeria quite soon. So yeah, that's basically where we are in terms of the project, and where we are at the moment in, you know, moving to that next stage of going to these different locations and really getting on with the kind of research we want to put into place. You know, a lot of it which will be oral histories, will be contemporary interviews with, you know, people in the kind of all sorts of cannabis stakeholders and so forth. And potentially some surveys as well, we hope to put into place as well. So yeah, so we're really chomping at the bit, so to speak, to get the project off and running in that kind of direct research. So yeah, any advice from you guys, I think we'll be very happy to hear in all those respects. So just to mention some project events that we'll be planning. So yeah, the University of Cape Town sometime this year, probably July, August, where we've been planning to hold a methods workshop. So this will be beyond our project, but looking about, you know, the kind of research methods that people use in researching something like cannabis, you know, which obviously in a lot of the context we'll be looking at is an illegal substance. So, you know, how do you go about researching these kinds of illicit trades? So this will be the focus of the workshop at University of Cape Town that we'll be getting together. The other thing to say is that we'll have a conference panel at the CRISA conference. So CRISA is this West African organisation chaired by Professor Isidore Obot, the Centre for Research and Information on Substance Abuse, and they have their biannual conference, which we'll be attending this year as well, and have a panel on cannabis at that conference. Then July 2024, we're aiming to organise a big conference on cannabis more broadly. So not just that focus on our particular case studies, but really push beyond a little bit with a conference on cannabis and policy around the world and all different aspects of cannabis, from development to consumption and so forth. So that will be aiming for July 2024, when we'll get that together and hopefully see a lot of you guys there. And then in October 2024, at the following CRISA conference, we'll get another panel together there at that you know, really very important conference on drugs and substance use in West Africa and Africa more broadly. So yeah, and then just to say a little bit, so one thing we want to introduce today, I'll kind of wrap it up with this one, I think, but what we wanted to introduce as well is we've had this idea to really start a network about drugs in Africa. So really have like an online platform where we can share lots of our findings. So not just about cannabis and the particularities of our project, but we really want to build up this network that facilitates collaboration and learning among peers doing related work about drugs in Africa, or perhaps widening that to other illicit economies as well. So this would hopefully be a very supportive, kind of constructive environment where perhaps we can meet. Clemens, we were discussing, weren't we, maybe once every 2 months or something like this. I think every few months to hold an event. So if anyone, again, as we come to the discussion today, if anyone has any good ideas, things that they would like to share, maybe works in progress or projects you're hoping to get up on similar themes, it'd be great to use this kind of network and have events like today where someone can present perhaps a short paper or work in progress in some regard, and then we can really get some nice discussion going, and book launches as well. So if anyone has any forthcoming books or articles they'd like to launch through the network, that would be fantastic. So I think I'll be handing over to Kelly now. I think I'm just about on time, Kelly. But just to say, we do have a Twitter account which Clemens has been taking charge of and using a lot. So our Twitter account, social media, is at Cannabis African. So you can find find us there, and a lot of info about the project and developments we'll put out through that. We also have a blog, Cannabis Africana blog, which we'll be updating as we move on through the project. And we also have a latest piece which has come out in the conversation, the academic research forum on cannabis policy changes in Africa, and looking at those issues about small producers versus that danger of corporate capture. So these are some things that would be great to you may wish to check out. But yeah, I'll hand over to Kelly for now. Thank you. And Kelly, shall I stop sharing? That would probably make sense with it, or
you're welcome to leave it on if anybody just wants to jot that down. But thanks everyone, and good timing there. You finished on the dot at 4:45. So just to share some of the inputs coming through in the chat. Thanks everyone again for sharing. More comments coming through on some of the research that was done. We have Prudence Africa that is sharing that her MA project that she's currently working on fits perfectly in the scope. We also have Dr. Yvette Abrams joining us from the San and Koi Center in the Center for African Studies at the University of Cape Town, that works on the history of Dacha, as we know it locally, amongst Indigenous people. Further comments is just to make contact. So Lala shared with us that she is in Ireland, a research associate at the University of Bristol, and she's working on a project around hidden narratives of illicit livelihoods in West Africa, and she's also shared a link with us there. Prudence has come up again to share with us around her MA work on contested expertise and authority regarding the making of the Interdepartmental Committee on Drug Abuse. And then I'm just going down to see that we've covered everyone. Wilson Box just agreed with Clemens, and the inputs around small producers of cannabis in Zimbabwe have nothing. And it's a good case study of the haves against the have-nots. Prudence then came in again to share a comment, and I wonder if Prudence doesn't want to come in and give her verbal input as well. But I'll just read this quickly, that she thinks the aspects of the biasness and the injustice of legalization is interesting. Cannabis gave rise to the underlying socioeconomic issues in many rural and semi-urban communities. It is interesting to note how the government's efforts of the prohibition and the clandestine trade, production, cultivation, and trade of cannabis are equivalent to each other. It is a socio-political conflict that included elements of morality, identity, race, and the economy. And then Gordon asked a question around, have we considered to look at what goes beyond policing of cannabis production and marketing, especially in Kenya? Tembisa shared that cannabis histories and apartheid's war on drugs is her NRF grant. Several of her postgrad students who will be keen to connect, and she will send us a list on that. That's about the last of the comments. And I think we can open the floor now for any questions and answers by way of just raising your hand, and we can then open the floor for that. But Prudence, I wonder if you don't want to come in and just share your insights that you've shared in the chat as well. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Prudence, and my project that I'm currently working on is focused on the Interdepartmental Committee on Drug Abuse in the Union of South Africa from 1949 to 1952. So I am focusing on the making of the report, who said what, who was asked questions, who was involved, the members of the committee. And what I'm gathering so far is that there's a lot of perspectives around what DAGA is and how it affects different people. And the committee devised a questionnaire. They sent the questionnaire to different police officials in different districts in 1949 to 1952. They also traveled to these different places in South Africa. And the questions are directed to the idea that DAGA is bad, it's a social problem, and it should be prohibited, if not eradicated completely. And also, I think that in terms of the underlying socio-economic issues that the DAGA topic gave rise to, my biggest question is these economic reforms that were suggested by several members of the community, they can be very costly and they can take time to implement. So I'm wondering, in the meantime, while these reforms are being implemented, what are the other measures that are in place that the government can do for these people that make a living out of selling cannabis and trading it, cultivating it? Because this cannabis economy is done very secretly. And how is the government going to overcome this challenge of this economy that the people that are involved in the trade and the production are not willing to say who their master is, are not willing to say who's involved? So I'm really interested in how the government is willing to tackle that issue. And also this shift that the government took in the 1930s to move from the supply side to move from the demand side to the supply side, meaning to move to these rural areas where cannabis is cultivated. I think that it's a very devastating strategy for those people in the rural areas who make a living out of this. And also, how can I put this? It also disrupts the controls or the rules that were put in place by the people in the rural areas, because now the economy in the urban areas and in the rural areas is not the same. In the urban areas, DAGA is consumed, produced, traded extensively, whereas in the rural areas, it's done on a very small scale, and also it's not as disturbing as it appears to be in the urban areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Prudence, for that insight. And I think maybe if it's good with our presenters today that we take a round of around 3 and then we can respond. So if that's good, I see Neil, you're shaking your head, nodding. So Justin, over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks very much for the presentation. I'm going to be quick because I have to rush off just now, and I hope you won't take this amiss, but I'm speaking really in my kind of advisory board role, where I'm supposed to exercise oversight. I think you need a bit more clarity on what overall your questions are and how they link together across your countries, because you've got lots of interesting things going on here. But I'm not, your title is drugs and development, for example, but a lot of your questions don't immediately speak to drugs and development as a theme. They go off in multiple different directions, all of which are very interesting. But I think you need to think, especially given that you may face some time constraints on the project, you need to think carefully about how you make sure that the different aspects of this cohere, because you're in a little bit of danger of having several slightly different projects in different countries asking slightly different questions about a broadly similar theme. And I'm sort of searching for a core hypothesis here that you're testing. And one I can hear is that I think you're talking about a long-term transition from a very repressive, colonially driven model of cannabis legislation towards a different commercially driven one. And your hypothesis is that there's a very kind of large danger of capture by large-scale commercial interests. Okay, if that's your overall hypothesis, then you might want to make sure that all of your different work speaks to that very clearly, and you might want to row back a bit from the kind of the very interesting but slightly different stuff about culture, music, and so on. So as I say, I'm in a bit of a rush, so forgive me for speaking quickly and bluntly, but I think that what you need to do is to make sure that you've got a coherent project here rather than 4 mini projects asking interesting questions about cannabis and its changing role in culture in 4 different places. Make sure that you focus, because otherwise you're going to get to the end of the project not quite sure what your overall argument is or where you've gone with this. I hope that's not too blunt. So, and as I say, forgive me for being brief about it, but I hope you see the point I'm making.
Oh, very much so. Yeah. Thanks very much, Justin.
Great, thanks so much, Justin. I wonder if Justin has a few minutes, if we, the presenters can quickly respond to Justin, but also to Pumla, and then also to Gordon's question in the chat around if we consider to look at what goes beyond policing of cannabis production and marketing, especially in Kenya, and then we can take another round. Thanks.
Should I quickly respond? Yeah, thanks ever so much, Prudence and Justin. And just in regard, I think this is a danger with something like cannabis because it is such an interesting topic. You know, which is likely to pull us, I think, when we are conducting the fieldwork into different directions. So you're very right. We need that core, and I think issues around livelihoods, whether urban and rural livelihoods. You know, this is where we do hope that the focus will come. But I think these things are related, though. You know how like cultures of consumption, how they change, and these kind of things. You know, these are related to aspects of policy, aspects of development, aspects of livelihoods as well. So I think from an anthropological kind of perspective, understanding that full sort of commodity chain from the start to consumption will be important. But yeah, for how we frame this around sort of livelihoods and development will be a key aspect we're working on. I'm not sure if other colleagues want to come in on that. But thank you, Justin.
Thank you so much, Clemens here. I think the questions that have been raised, they are very important. I think with regard to what Justin has asked regarding the need for us to develop a coherent, maybe a key theme that ties together the 4 countries, I think that is something that is important. And he is right, yes, to say that what is suggested by the focus of our project is this nexus between development and the drugs. And I think this is where issues to do with the socioeconomic role that drugs also play in the livelihoods of different communities. I think that's part of that. But again, I think as Neil is saying that even issues to do with the different meanings. So I think the project also, while we are focusing on that, but it's also to acknowledge that there are different meanings and different ways people relate to cannabis. And so I think with regard to the question that Prudence has asked, what can governments do, for example, to replace, for example, cannabis in the lives of those who are affected? I think the first thing, the first thing for us to do is to step a little backwards and understand that people do not always, not everyone who produces, for example, cannabis or who engages in drugs, they engage as a way of just being the love for rebellion or the fact that they are not afraid of going to jail, but it's a development issue. So you will find that for some communities, you have states that fail to provide whether it's services, development in the areas where some people stay. I think if you look at cases like studies in Lesotho, studies in Swaziland, you will see grannies who are nurturing kids who are orphans from parents who have died from HIV, AIDS, and other diseases, and producing cannabis and use it to support their family. So it's a development issue. And I think, like what Justin has said, is for us now to tie this together, make sure that we show this relationship between development and the drugs. But as for what can governments do, I think that's part of what we are grappling with here, starting also with the trying to speak into this debate around how can policies be reformed to make sure that because these policies are being reformed anyway, but in what way can they be reformed in a way that it brings inclusivity and make sure that the interests and the concerns and the situations of the people who are involved in drugs and drug crops and who have been producing drug crops is also addressed. So I think this is the challenge that we are dealing with. But I think this is a development issue, and it's something that we have to look at. Yes. Thank you.
So just to speak to the first comment around the government's responses to cannabis regulation or criminalization, I mean there is a clear history of injustice and a clear disparity in the way in which different sectors of the population or different people within the population have been treated via the cannabis laws and the cannabis policing operations that have occurred. And typically, small-scale farmers in South Africa have ended up bearing the brunt of the legislative consequences of cannabis criminalization, in the sense that they would end up growing cannabis for basic sort of economic reasons, yet end up facing extensive and hefty jail terms because they would essentially be considered dealers of a restricted and illegal drug. And the result of which is there's not only been sort of marginalization, alienation, but a lot of sort of economic impact in terms of communities and in terms of people's lives, because of the arrest and the sort of criminalization there. So as you mentioned, that things are changing and that there is a drive towards the inclusive undertaking of small-scale cannabis growers. But in the interim, one way of dealing with the consequences of a couple of decades of criminalization is to begin thinking about how we can immediately change the law, if not change the law directly, but sort of put a hiatus on the arrest of small-scale dealers, for instance, of cannabis. Because I mean, in South Africa, cannabis has been decriminalized for private use, but private use does not extend beyond the home, which is ironic considering that, you know, the home as defined in the cannabis law is not something that applies to many, it only applies to a small minority of South Africans in the first place. So, you know, how do we understand that type of legal wrangling, and how do we manipulate it so as that it can be useful for a wider cohort of society? So, you know, I mean, we could, for instance, decriminalize the small-scale dealers, or decriminalize the growing of cannabis for economic reasons, for instance, you know, for purely economic, for survival reasons. In the same way that large-scale corporations seem to be able to now obtain licenses for this type of activity, you know, I mean, we could consider that as something, and I would say we, I mean, the South African government could consider that as something that would, at least in the interim, begin taking the punitive pressure off those who are most vulnerable and those who ultimately have borne the brunt of the criminalization domain within the country for many years now. Thanks.
Oh, Kelly, I wonder, we didn't answer Gordon's question, did we? I wonder if Gordon said if he could just repeat it, or if you could, Kelly.
Yeah, Gordon, are you here? Would you like to share? Or I'm happy to read it as well. I see Gordon is still here, but I'll read it quickly in the interest of time. So Gordon's asked, have you considered to look at what goes beyond policing of cannabis production and marketing, especially in Kenya?
What goes beyond policing in terms of, yeah, not quite sure the context there to the, but in terms of however, like, social networks maybe are involved in producing it or regulating it.
Yeah, just he's just saying policing of cannabis production and marketing. Gordon, if you are with us, if you can come off mute and share with us, that would be great. But I think in the interest of time, what we can do, Gordon, if you do come off mute, you can just let us know. But I'll hand over to Tim Bisa and Pumla for a set of questions. There Gordon is. Great. Gordon, after you, Pumla, and then Tim Bisa. Thanks.
Yeah, what I wanted to know is basically after, because in Kenya, of course, we have legislation on, you know, some restrictive legislation on the use of cannabis, but you find that there are still people, of course, planting, producing this cannabis, and even selling them. But in some cases, you find that they are sometimes you know, arrested and the cannabis confiscated. But the picture here is that after these cannabis have been taken by the enforcement officers, they're always put in the police stations, but they disappear later on. So that's what I'm trying to find out, that in the project, have you considered maybe going beyond just policing at that level of these cannabis being taken to the police? Then what happens to these cannabis in terms, of course, after they have been taken to the police stations? Thank you.
Oh, should I just come in on that, Kelly?
Sure, and then thereafter we can take the next round. Thank you, Neil.
Or we could maybe get those questions first, should we? And then
maybe a good round. All right, Pumla, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I joined in late. I was struggling with the link that I was given, but thank you, Kelly, for for plugging me with the right one. So I didn't listen to Clement's presentation because I joined in late, but I have a few questions. So to those that do not know what I'm focusing on, so basically my research interest is in the aerial spraying of glyphosate in Pondoland, which is in the Eastern Cape, South Africa. So overall, I'm looking at the policing of dagga in in South Africa from the 1970s to the late 1990s. So hence I am focusing on the spraying of glyphosate herbicide on the Taga plants. So I just want to know, Clement, in any of the cannabis research that you came across in Zimbabwe, have you ever came across information that implies to the involvement of the South African police or South African Defence Force pre-apartheid and South African National Defence Force post-apartheid? And is there any information on chemical crop spraying on cannabis plants in Zimbabwe and the response of the growers to that particular activity? And also, I would like to know when it began and how it was conducted and who was involved in the chemical spraying, if it ever occurred in Zimbabwe over the years. And also, I just wanted to know whether there is any cultural changes within the cannabis markets in Zimbabwe or the cannabis cultivation in Zimbabwe, because during my fieldwork research in Pondoland, which is now known as Amampondweni, I found that a lot of growers have now been discouraged to grow Dacha because of the changes in the market. For instance, there is now demand for a different kind of cannabis known as cheese, which is cultivated differently from the traditionally grown cannabis in Pondoland over the years. So are there any cultural change in the cultivation of cannabis in Zimbabwe? And if so, how has that affected small farmers in the market? And not only in Zimbabwe, but in also other African countries, to those that are studying the other, cannabis growing in cannabis cultivation in other African countries. So I just want to make a comparison with my own findings at this side. Thank you.
Thanks, Pumla. Timbisa, would you like to go next?
Thanks so much. I also was a bit late, so I apologize if my question is redundant. I'm so interested in this project, and one of the reasons I'm interested in it is because I think it's bringing political economy into discussions and also speaking about issues that I think have the potential to transform the ontologies of cannabis in a way that work done by people like myself, as a historian who looks at the way that the language and the discourses and around lawmaking and state making in ideas of nationhood and some of the contestations around that can't actually focus on it all. And so what I'm really wondering about and hoping for is ways in which this project and your work will help change the language. And what I'd like to ask you is, how important do you think, this linking of cannabis to the word drug? Historically, that seems to be so important in shaping the tenor of the policy debates themselves. And, even some of the findings of some of the parliamentary debates in South Africa in 1995, just right after as the ANC came into power, that notion of drug and that idea, the sort of moral idea of drug, seems to just freeze any kind of debate that can take place, even though there are concerns about growers, there are concerns about police violence, there are concerns about the punitive nature of the law. Is there a way that your research and your grappling with people who are involved in the cultivation and uses? I know Clemens said there are so many different meanings and practices that involve cannabis that are outside this sort of narrow notion of, the Eurocentric ideas about intoxication, for example, or categories of medicine. Is there a way that that language can be brought into the public domain and even for new forms of research to shift the language away from a kind of reification of drug? I hope that question is clear, and I hope it's not redundant to what you've already said in the first two presentations. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Timbisa. I'll hand over to our presenters to just share some feedback on that. And then there are a couple of questions and inputs in the chat as well that we'll do as a next round. Thanks.
Oh, shall I come in first? Yeah, thanks. Great questions, everyone. And yeah, going back to Gordon, talking about what does happen to these seizures, kind of post the arrests being made and post the consignments being kept. I suppose that there is all that theatre, isn't there, of the burning of cannabis, which is seen quite a lot. But I think in Kenya, it's often the theatrical performance of uprooting the plants and then those plants being taken away. But yeah, what does happen to those plants after that would be an interesting question. How easy it would be to get some concrete answers on that might be quite a different question, I think. But yes, no, certainly a very good question. Like you know, how does state involvement in the cannabis trade function? And maybe that's one area where there may be some input in, these seizures are made, but then perhaps that cannabis still enters the market sometime later. And there's certainly all that discourse about, obviously, about corruption and things like that that I think will be really interesting to have a look at. Yeah, but Pumla, great questions, and such a great project you're working on as well. And I like I'm sure Clemens will come in and Simon as well, I'm sure, with more precise things in Zimbabwe, South Africa. But I do find it fascinating, as I was saying, like the different varieties of cannabis, looking at that East African side of things, shash, this one that seems so popular in Nairobi and elsewhere, this Ethiopian variety, and also the fact that Kenyan consumers, sometimes do access cannabis from as far away as Malawi and things like this. Like, yeah, this aspect of how people talk about the different varieties of cannabis. And it does link back in a way to my previous work on this substance cat, which also comes in many different varieties in Kenya, all of which are different, consumers will talk about them in different ways. So looking at cannabis in the same way, I think, will be good. And that does link as well quite maybe to aspects of the danger of corporate capture, because one thing that people have written about and talked about is looking at the so-called strain hunters, often people coming from countries like the Netherlands, with quite a thriving trade in cannabis, who will go out into places, perhaps into parts of the Congo or some parts of Congo, something like that, to find particular strains of cannabis, which then, they then market, they then breed and market without necessarily people in the Congolese farmers, for example, who had for years, trained that and got to grips with the agriculture of that particular variety. They may not see any benefit. So this is something I think where all these talks about varieties might just link as well to that sort of aspect of corporate capture, these kind of questions, who benefits from these kind of trades. So, and yeah, Tembisa, no, great question. And again, I often do fall back onto my cat research as well. But cat always had that, the people who described it as a drug or wanted to define it in that kind of way, versus maybe the farmers and a lot of people who were trying to promote the trade of it, who always try and pull back from defining cat by this category of drug. And also, really interesting anthropological literature as well, I think, on that, how these different kind of substances, maybe psychoactive substances, if we use that term, how they are categorized in different ways, in different cultural contexts, different societies and so forth. But I think we'll definitely, as Clemens was saying, and he can speak more to this, but pulling out those different meanings of the substance and maybe where that language comes into the debate, like perhaps similar to that cat debate, where people try and try and paint cannabis as a drug and then conflate it with all these other substances, and where people might try and push back against categorizing it in that kind of way, and maybe use, and what other kind of categories people are using. But I think that that's something we'll definitely be looking at in quite a bit of detail. So yeah, so thank you all three of you for great questions, and I'll hand over to my colleagues.
Okay, I think I can come next. And then if Simon has something to add, he can come later. Okay, I will start with so Pumla, you asked, I think I can summarize 2 questions. The first is to send around the use of chemicals in spraying as a way of control of cannabis production. And in that also whether the South African police or defense forces, the South African party has had any role that they have played in Zimbabwe. This is something that I am yet to come across. Like we have indicated also that we are still more at the formative stage. But from the archival research that we have done so far, from the University of Oxford, the archives, what I haven't come across the South African police and or any role of South African police and the defense forces and their use of chemicals in Zimbabwe. What we see in the Zimbabwean, the Rhodesian police reports from the 1950s up to the late 70s, which is what we have got at this stage, that there wasn't much, even in terms of the amounts of cannabis that was being confiscated. The Zimbabwean side was not doing much. It seems it's either they did not have much capacity. In some reports, you get the idea that they were focusing more in the urban areas and the areas that are around those urban areas. And the amounts that were being confiscated were very insignificant, ranging from just a cigarette, it could send you to prison, to a few hundreds of kgs. As compared, so far, I've been looking at both South African and Zimbabwean archives. So what I have seen is that South Africa was doing more in terms of confiscation and also control, and compared to the Zimbabwean side. The Zimbabwean side wasn't doing much in terms of that is during the colonial era. I don't have much regarding post-1980. This is something that I'm looking forward to when I go to Zimbabwe and when I do more archival work also. But the use of chemicals, I haven't come across something that that shows either its use or maybe its significant use as a way of control. Then regarding the cultural changes in production or cultivation of cannabis, again, this is something that we are going to find out, but from experience and growing in Zimbabwe, being a Zimbabwean, you would see in the language of our people, there would be certain areas where they will prefer that the cannabis that come maybe, for instance, from Chipinge in the east of Zimbabwe is more preferred compared to what is grown in other areas. So I would think that there are certain areas where through their natural means of selection of varieties and all that, they have, even right now when we look at mainstream state media, you hear stories of people being arrested coming from the east of Zimbabwe. So they will move from Harare in the capital in the north, or in other areas where there's Blawa in the west, but they go to the east. But that's not the only area, but I think it suggests that there are different cultures of cultivation, but also the different varieties that are there as well. And then Tembisa, regarding the issue of the language, I think it's a very important contribution and question that you are highlighting, and it's something that we are in this project, we are looking forward also to explore. And it takes me to a presentation, the presentations by Pumla, who is here. We have contributed earlier on, and Kelly's presentation at the ASA conference, which we just had in April at UCT, where, and the context here is that in Pondoland, they were talking of a situation where villagers within a particular village would even organize some kind of cooperative to pull labor from their neighbors to come and help with the cultivation or with the harvesting of cannabis. And it made me wonder, say, if something, it means that they have a different understanding or relationship with this crop, which others call a drug. And once it's called a drug, then it comes with all sorts of connotations. But no one would want to be associated with a drug. It means that for them, they have a different way, the different lenses, ontological lenses of looking and relating to this crop. So I think that it's something that tells me that even the issue of trying to explore the language, the different meanings, and how people relate to cannabis is something that is important, and language plays an important role there. Thank you so much.
Sorry, just to add my few comments on this. In terms of spraying of herbicide on crops in Zimbabwe by the South African police or the South African Defence Force, as far as I'm aware, and I stand corrected, I don't think I've ever heard of it happening, not in recent times at least. You know, I mean, that being said, the characteristic of the war on drugs as a whole is that it essentially provided a means of overriding sovereignty and undertaking sort of incursions into other people's domains in the name of drugs and the combating thereof. But in the South African or Southern African instance, I have not heard of it occurring, both in terms of, you know, I think cost would be one critical factor, and essentially also, you know, concerns around sovereignty and the use of someone else's political, I mean, so the Defence Force for fought a war by other means, which I sense would be somewhat problematic. But I mean, you know, I mean, that's, I stand corrected. There may be something in archives which reveals that this has in fact occurred. Just speaking to the discourse around drugs and the way in which drugs is inherently normative and, you know, and laden with meaning, especially in the South African context. You know, I don't think we can work towards completely reappropriating the word or completely disengaging cannabis from the discourse around drugs, but I think we can sort of provide at least some further work towards, if you call it this, a deconstructive moment in which we can nip at the heels of the meaning and begin engaging with the way in which historically and contemporarily drugs and cannabis have been entwined in such a manner as to create a normative concept, which is, again, not only laden with meaning, but in the South African consciousness has been laden with a very specific understanding of what constitutes evil and what constitutes, you know, the bad and the immoral and everything else. And I mean, you know, one characterization of this is when people in South Africa complain about drugs while sitting in a bar drinking alcohol. And, you know, they don't see any conflict here in both, you know, in both pharmaceutical terms, but also in terms of the way in which the narrative is cashed out. But there is, obviously, and, you know, I mean, in terms of, and you can cash that narrative out in many ways, but I think for the terms of this project, one aspect of it is to be concerned with understanding the ways in which the discourse has changed over the years and the way in which various narratives have informed that discourse and informed the way in which cannabis has come to be understood in the contemporary, both in South African society, if one could do that, but also in terms of the law, and begin, you know, by virtue of documenting that, begin working at reappropriating it in some way, so as that ultimately the concept of drugs is questioned, but equally the concept of cannabis is decoupled at least as far as possible, from the concept of a drug. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon, Neil, and Clemens. I see we have got 3 minutes left, and there's just a couple of inputs in the chat that I thought I could just highlight very quickly. From Malvin, just saying that it would be interesting to see what the research will unearth in the Zimbabwean case on why small-scale farmers are being excluded, in most cases criminalized, from the production of cannabis in favor of the international or big pharmaceuticals. Francis sharing a similar sentiment around that he wishes the research will also extend to Zimbabwe, as the government is warming to cannabis production. We've had small-scale producers from time immemorial who has been criminalized. And then just lastly, from Witness saying the use of cannabis by guerrillas during the liberation war time of distress in Zimbabwe. I have come across a report speaking to this and how cannabis continues to be used in times of distress, economic and social political in the country. And I see that there's just a last comment coming through from Sloan to say that she's also interested in the medical, officially sanctioned and also more intimate self-medicating use for archival sources. I wonder if big pharma sites like Novartis might have data on modern use of legal medical use, including in South Africa. Their archives in Basel are amazingly helpful. So that basically wraps it up. Also just a question around whether the presentation or the recordings can be shared. But over to the presenters for final and concluding remarks. Thanks.
Oh, shall I start? Oh, just to say thank you to everyone, and thanks to you as well, Kelly, for chairing proceedings so well. And yeah, it's wonderful to get all that input. And like I say, that this is really just the the project, I think, is gearing up now. So I think lots more opportunities to get feedback and get you all involved in some ways, however many ways you might be comfortable with the project. So really grateful for everyone taking the time and coming along today to give their input. So thank you very much, everyone.
Simon, would you like to go next, and then Clemens?
Well, thank you everyone for your inputs and for joining us at this project launch. And yeah, I'm sure we will see each other and hear from each other again in the future at future events. And yeah, definitely food for thought and things we can take on board and further going forward.
Thank you so much, Kelly, the project team, and all colleagues who have come to interact with us today. The input that you have given is very helpful. It helps us to think more around how we are framing the project going forward. And also regarding the recording, yes, we have recorded so that we could also share with those who are interested. So we do have your email addresses, so I will communicate and make sure that you have access to the recording. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Over to you, Kelly.
Oh, no, thanks everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to chair this very insightful session today. It seems as if it is the first of many conversations, so I look forward to the next steps as well. Thanks everyone for joining and for the inputs. Thought-provoking, certainly it was. Take care, and for us in South Africa, have a good evening further, and for those abroad, have a good day further. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.